I always knew I had a great uncle that fought in World War II. My grandfather on my dad's side briefly told me a story in my teenage years about how his little brother had died overseas in England. "What happened?" I asked. His response? He crashed on takeoff. I felt like I had remembered him muttering something about a B-25. And up until that point, and for another 2 decades after, I never knew much about his role in the service. Someone told me once that he was a gunner. And after hearing these anecdotes here and there, it was determined that nobody knew exactly where he was buried. My grandparents were told, long ago, that he was buried in Cambridge American Cemetery. They tried to go overseas in the 1980s but could never find my Uncle Robby's grave. Almost 40 years later, a work trip with my company changed all that. Back in 2016, I worked for a company out of Kansas City, flying a Gulfstream. Most of our trips involved flying board members on various business engagements. Some of these business trips brought us to London. Such a trip would usually show up on our schedule about once a quarter. We would load the Gulfstream with fuel, verify our clearance with air traffic control, and unpackage the catering and place them appropriately in cold storage for the ride over. We were usually underway by 6 in the evening. Our first stop was Goose Bay in Newfoundland. Now, not many pilots particularly liked this fuel stop. Except for a couple months out of the year, it was usually quite cold and paired with a biting wind that made you curse all the way to the fuel shack. Our stops were often in the middle of the night, as our plan was to arrive first thing in the morning in England. I, for one, loved this stop. Over 7 decades ago, it was the fuel stop of choice for B-24s, B-17s, P-51s, P-38s, and the list goes on. I would stand on the tarmac and imagine the ramp filled with brand new warbirds fueling up and heading over the pond to protect and secure the future of our families. Once refueled, we would wait on our departure window with Gander radio. When our clearance was received, we had only a couple of minutes to light the engines and head out towards the departure gate. By 6 a.m., the sun would be rising, and Shamwick Oceanic would hand us off to Shannon Approach as we sailed across Ireland. By 7 a.m., we would be touching down in the outskirts of London, either in Stansted, Luton, or Biggin Hill. Passengers' bags would be loaded in their vehicles, the APU would start powering down, and us pilots would grab a captain's cocktail for our Hackney carriage ride to the hotel. We had plenty of time to reflect on the trip. We talked about what went well, what could have been improved upon, and each of us would tell a tale or two. During this ride, I had mentioned to my friend Rich, who was one of the 3 pilots traveling on this trip, that I had an uncle that served over here in World War II. He asked for details, and I had none. That would eventually change by pure happenstance. On this particular visit, we were scheduled to be in London for 7 days. We were told by the bosses that they would give us at least 24 hours notice if for some reason they needed to leave early. We arrived at our hotel at 8:30 a.m., and as you can probably figure out, we didn't exactly have the ability to pop an Ambien on the way over. Having been up all night, we still had to reset our clocks, but had the entire day still in front of us. What better way to reset our clocks than power through at the local pub with a pint or two? This always proved to be fun, but also exhausting. By 7 in the evening, the 3 of us were usually out for the count, but the next morning always gave us a fresh start and would allow us to enjoy several days in England before heading back to the U.S. To this day, the 3 of us pilots are still suckers for an Imperial War Museum. No need to shop around for admission rates. We'll walk right in no matter the cost. One of our pilots had always wanted to visit the War Museum in Duxford, and no extra effort was used to convince us as we immediately headed to King's Cross Station to catch the next train. We boarded the next train direct to Cambridge. Plenty of cabs were outside the station, ready to grab a fare from us Americans or round up any students wishing to head to the university. It was a 15-minute ride to the museum, and we all emerged from the cab with suppressed excitement. I'll give you a brief explanation as to how they structure this museum. It's not like any other museum that you'll find. Duxford has a main building, complete with a lobby to buy your ticket, a gift shop, cafeteria, and a small hangar that houses some introductory airplanes that, while impressive, doesn't even come close to matching what else they have in store for you. Duxford has 4 major hangars. And to give you an idea of how big these hangars actually are, the United States has a B-52 parked in the middle of the hangar. Everything else in the hangar is parked around it, underneath it, or hanging from the ceiling. Rolling up to the U.S. hangar is a sight to see. The pathway to the doors are lined with several transparent glass walls, each containing countless frosted silhouettes of bombers and fighters, each one of those representing a single crew that was lost during World War II. Inside the hangar was a field day for us, an F-15 hanging from the ceiling, a B-24 parked under the B-52, an SR-71 in the corner. It was an aviation enthusiast's paradise. Over in another corner stood the entrance to a room. Above the entrance read the words, "The Roll of Honor." As you walk into the room, the walls are covered with digital rolling screens with nothing but names. Every name is an airman that lost their life during the war. It was awe-striking, and after a few moments of silence and outright respect for the names and headshots rolling by, Rich says to me, "You think your uncle's going to be on this wall?" My reply, "Not a chance. My grandparents tried to find him a long time ago and they never found anything. He's long gone." "Well," he says, "we're on the L's. We might as well stick around for Mercurio." I was excited but pessimistic. I knew there'd be nothing. But here come the M's. There were a lot of them, all over the room, and the screen only stays up for about 30 seconds, so it can roll on to the next series of letters. We rushed around the room to find the right spot. Sure enough, there he was, Robert Thomas Mercurio. Son of a gun. Someone has information on him. We head back to the main building and walk briskly to the information desk. I ask, "Do you have any information on Robert Thomas Mercurio?" His reply, "Well, what all do you want?" Everything," I said. After a couple of keystrokes, he recites, here's his service number, his enlistment date, his bomb group, his bomb squadron, burial plot, aircraft. Whoa. Burial plot? Where's he buried? Cambridge American Cemetery, he says. How far is that from here? Oh, it's just about 5 minutes down the road. Many thanks in a short time frame were extended his way as I grabbed the printout he provided for me and proceeded to look up the hours of operation for the cemetery. It closes at 4 p.m., and it is now 3:30. We call a cab, and we all pile in. "Do you know where Cambridge American Cemetery is?" I asked. The driver says, "Oh, yeah, it's right on the way to the train station. I'll drop you." We arrive at the gates not 5 minutes before closing. Susie Harrison was already taking down the flag for the day. Not wanting to be rude and interrupt their duties, I quickly asked if they could point me in the direction of Plot D, Row 6, Grave 80. "Are you next of kin?" she asked. "As a matter of fact, I am," I said. She dropped everything she was doing and walked inside the building. The three of us looked at each other with curiosity. We didn't know what was going on. Moments later, she emerged from the building holding supplies. She was holding 2 flags, one United States, one Great Britain. She was also holding something that resembled a sponge and a jar of sand. "This is a very exciting day," she said. "I just looked him up in the computer, and you're officially the first person on record to visit him in 71 years. My heart was racing as we followed her back to the cemetery. She stopped by an enormous live oak tree. Under the tree, with the rest of his buddies, stood the cross of Robert Thomas Mercurio, Brooklyn, New York, 453rd Bomb Group, 735th Bomb Squadron Heavy. Died January 1st, 1945. The sand she held was sand from the beaches of Normandy, and she used it to dress the letters of the grave. She left us alone and told us that we could take all the time we needed. She stayed on property for another hour and a half just for us. During this time, we spent time with Robby, realizing that he was the very first Mercurio in the air and that the tradition had continued for another 2 generations thus far. I shared pictures and video with my father, who had only been up for a few hours back at home. He, in turn, shared the news with my grandmother, who is still alive to this day at age 95. She, sister-in-law to my Uncle Robby, is one of the very few left alive that can even verify that he even existed. She cried after hearing that he was found and was astounded that a total fluke of a visit to a museum had unlocked this mystery. But I wanted more. Upon leaving the cemetery and saying our goodbyes, Susie Harrison gave me a few printouts, one of which contained my Uncle Robby's crew manifest, along with the aircraft serial number. Off to the hotel I go. It's Google time. Upon further research, I found out that his aircraft that went down was a B-24 Liberator, not a B-25 as my grandfather had mentioned in passing years ago. I also noticed in my search that his bomb group was part of the 8th Air Force, and they had a website that was absolutely littered with hundreds of pictures of aircraft and crew. Several minutes of research had me stumbling on countless pictures of Hollywood's very own Jimmy Stewart. He was only stationed with the 453rd for a short period of time there at Old Buckingham, but had obviously made quite an impression. I had hundreds of pictures to sift through online, none of which were labeled well, and certainly not with my uncle's name plastered all over it. After looking at almost 700 pictures, all looking almost identical with 10 crew members standing in front of the nose of their B-24s, I stumbled on a picture that contained almost 0 smiles, with text at the very bottom that caught my eye. 7-10-44, Judd 735. Judd. Why did that name look familiar? 735 is probably the squadron number, and 7-10-44 is probably the date. But who's Judd? Oh, Judd. Alan Judd. He's on the crew manifest that Susie gave me. He's the pilot. Uncle Robby has to be in here somewhere. I searched through the 10 crew members depicted, and on the bottom row, in the very center, knelt a Mercurio, if I've ever seen one in my life, with a goofy look on his face like he's chewing a stick of Beeman's. I tried to verify it with my father, but he said he wasn't 100% sure. He printed the picture out and mailed it to my grandmother. She verified that it was, in fact, my Uncle Robby. I now have a picture of my uncle's crew in front of their airplane. But I wanted more. I called my dad up one day and said, I want to go interview Gran. I think it'd be great to get her thoughts on video. We hopped in my dad's Cessna 182 and flew out to Virginia, where she gave the performance of a lifetime, both regarding Uncle Robby as well as the entire family. During the visit, she pulled out a letter that was written to her by my uncle. Now, I won't share verbatim exactly what the letter contained. I'd like to keep that in the family, but it did mention that he was over the halfway mark and that he'd most likely be coming home soon. He explained that it looked like the Red Cross was stealing things from his packages, as he noticed that it would only arrive with half a salami and a half a pack of cigarettes. The letter was dated December 21st, 1944. As the months continued, I dug further. I was able to decipher, based on documents gathered and data from other aircraft pictures on the website, the paint and markings that made up his airplane. I spent months researching how to build a 1/48 scale model to the exact specifications. And after 16 months of research and 11 months of construction, the model was completed. But I still wanted more. I was running low on information. I was tapped out at every corner. I had downloaded overhead maps of the airfield and had plotted my theories as to where the aircraft would have crashed based on declassified accident reports that I had found. I was sending random emails down rabbit holes based on Google searches that I had done asking anyone if they had any additional information on my uncle's crew or his accident. I received no return emails. Until one day, in September of 2017, over a year from our initial visit to England, I received an email from a man named James Clary. James' email writes, "Thank you for your inquiry. I'd be very pleased to help you with your research. If you could let me know what information you require, I'll check my records. Additionally, I have picked up over the years several fragments of his B-24. If you would like some of them, please let me know, and I shall post you some across." I was obviously floored by this email. Fragments of his B-24? Surely this was a mix-up. Who was this guy that I had emailed so long ago? He was going to mail me aircraft parts? Is he insane? This seemed kind of fishy. A further search on James concluded that he was the curator of the 453rd Bomb Group Museum, which was located there at Old Buckenham Airfield, an airfield that is still active to this day to civilians. This guy is the real deal. And what's more, he proved to be one of the kindest, most generous people I've ever met. Before he was able to mail me the photos, documents, and parts, another trip to London had popped up on my schedule. We were leaving in a week. I informed James of my plans, and to my surprise, he mentioned that he would set up a private tour for me and my crew when we arrived. Before we knew it, there we were at King's Cross Station once again. This time, we were to take the train, make a 7-minute connection in Cambridge, and head for our final stop of Attleboro. I had remembered a picture of the Attleboro train station on the 453rd Bomb Group website. I was ignorantly wishing for it to be exactly the same as the picture, hoping to step out of a time machine again into 1945. Our train rolls to a stop, and to my surprise, I step onto a stone platform that bears all the resemblance of wartime England. Only one difference: we weren't stepping out of a steam locomotive. We meet up with James and hop in his car. The first place he takes us? The crash site. Now, the amount of knowledge that this guy has is endless. I realized this a couple minutes late and immediately start recording video on my iPhone. The majority of our time there, I wasn't pointing the camera at anything specific. I was merely letting the camera roll to capture the audio because I knew I wasn't capable of absorbing everything this guy had to say. I was in the middle of information overload. We parked the car over by the entrance to the airfield just down the road from Jimmy's Cafe. I followed James down Abbey Road to a familiar hedge line that I had seen in photos. My phone is still recording. My chief pilot, David, followed both of us with his Nikon anxiously poised. We walked through the damp grass along the hedge line, and James says, "If you ever want to come back here, let me know and I'll escort you. The people that own this land know who I am." I guess that implies that intruders aren't welcome. We stop at the base of a live oak tree on the hedge line. "This is where the plane came to rest," he said. At that very spot, I received the story of exactly what happened to my uncle and why. Back then, when the military was active on the field, there was a little kid that lived nearby. His name was Pat Ram. If you ever make your way to the 453rd Bomb Group site, you might even run across Pat posing in pictures with air and ground crew. Pat never left his hometown. Over the years, James Clary began to know Pat very well. Pat was a wealth of eyewitness knowledge, and that knowledge flowed through James over the years. On January 1st, 1945, Pat Ram witnessed my uncle's airplane crash on takeoff. Unfortunately, I was never able to speak with Pat, as he passed away from cancer 2 years prior, but the story was alive and well in James's brain. My Uncle Robby, a top turret gunner on their B-24J and crew, were a Pathfinder airplane. Their belly turret was replaced with a radar pod. Now, this radar pod, in conjunction with a Pathfinder operator, was capable of seeing ground targets through clouds during a bomb run. 2 additional crew members, totaling 12, were needed for a Pathfinder configuration. The Pathfinder aircraft led the pack, and all other B-24s would bomb off of the Pathfinder's contact with the target. On the same day as this mission, the month-long Battle of the Bulge was creeping up on its halfway point. If you recall, the Battle of the Bulge occurred during one of the most frigid winters on record. New Year's morning at Old Buckingham Airfield was consistent with the same type of weather. The 453rd woke up to snow, freezing rain, and freezing fog. After their briefing, my uncle's Pathfinder crew, serial number 42-51865, fired up all 4 engines. They were de-iced on their hard stand and proceeded to take the number 1 spot on the runway. While they were waiting for the rest of the 735th Squadron to get de-iced, they began to ice up again. Most likely, they knew that they were accumulating ice, but it's wartime, and it's not like everyone can go back for another round of de-icing. They had a window to hit, and it was time to go. The B-24 had a very high-performance airfoil known as the Davis wing. It didn't carry as much surface area as the B-17 wing, and the B-24 was built for speed, as much as a bomber could be. The sarcastic saying along the Liberator line was that the Davis wing couldn't hold enough ice to chill your drink. Pilot Alan Judd attempted to break ground, but most likely stalled the left wing during takeoff roll. Pilots were trained that if they're unable to break ground, keep trying. Now, this may sound silly, especially to the modern-day pilot, but the J-model B-24 was the heaviest gross weight aircraft of all the B-24 models. Combine that with thousands of pounds of fuel, bombs, and an icy sloped runway, and the last thing you want to do is try to slam on the brakes. She will never stop. Judd did exactly what he was supposed to do. He kept trying to get it into the air. While the left wing most likely stalled, it caused the airplane to veer to the left off of the runway. It cut across multiple hardstands, damaging 2 other B-24s in the process, but without harming any bystanders. The airplane cut across Abbey Road and attempted to land in the very field that I was standing in. With its landing gear down, the left main gear hit a large tree stump that James was able to point out to me. This caused the airplane to cartwheel, the tail departed the airplane, as it's the weakest part of the airframe, and the rest of the ship was severely mangled. 2 men survived this crash. Frank Pitkovich was labeled as SIA on the accident report. This stood for seriously injured in action. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any information on him after the war. The second man that survived was a right waist gunner. His name was Walter Beck. Walter was thrown from the right waist gun position and walked away from the crash with minor scrapes and bruises. He was labeled as EUS on the crash report, which stood for Escaped Unscathed. I was finally able to track down Walter's whereabouts. It proved difficult given the somewhat boilerplate first and last name, but he passed away in 2006, long before I ever made any of these discoveries. After the wreck, 2 more B-24s launched. When the 4th airplane attempted takeoff, it experienced the same icing issue. In a split decision, the pilot decided to abort after seeing what happened to my uncle's airplane. They slammed on the brakes, completely totaled the airplane, but everybody lived. After that, the base commander shut down operations. It was nice to get some closure on what had actually happened. My buddy David snapped a picture with me at the base of the tree along the hedge line, and we continued our tour. James also brought us to the original runway. The asphalt is still there, but it has since been intertwined with Mother Earth constantly changing around it. You can still see, however, the distinct slope in the land where the challenging runway used to sit. James proceeded to bring us to his museum, which is an absolute treasure trove of memorabilia. Back in his office, the layout gave off a vibe of complete chaos paired with organization. If you didn't know what half of the stuff was in his office, it was chaos. But if you put together the pieces of what you were looking at, it was beautifully orchestrated. He walked around some shelves to pick up a clear vinyl packet full of more junk. Junk to the untrained eye. It was my uncle's airplane. He had found these pieces in 1998 in the very spot where we had been standing. He said, "I've been holding on to these since then, and nobody has come by to claim them yet. They are yours now. And oh, you might want to keep a close eye on this one." The piece in particular that he pointed out was a clear piece of perspex. "That," James exclaimed, "is a piece of your uncle's top turret." I didn't believe him at first. How could this little piece possibly be from his turret, and how could he possibly know? This was the question that I had asked. He immediately lunged for a book on the shelf, as if already prepared for my question. Equipped with a magnifying glass, he picks out the exact page to show the dimensions of the top turret and the curvature associated with the glass. He goes on to explain, "There are only two places, based off of curvature and thickness, that this piece could have originated from. Either the top turret or the belly turret. And your uncle's Pathfinder airplane didn't have a belly turret on it that day." He points with his index finger again and says, "That's the top turret." I held it up to the light, looked through it, and realized that I was only the second person in my family to ever look through that piece of glass. The first one looked through that piece of glass for 18 missions. About that time, James brought me to the front of the museum to introduce me to Bernie. Bernie was in his late 80s and was a young kid in 1945. He had a thick, country British accent. So once again, the camera started rolling. He told me that he had been walking to school on Abbey Road the morning of the crash. While he didn't witness the crash, he saw the debris sitting in the field with the emergency vehicles surrounding it. He looked up in a tree near the road and noticed something hanging from a branch. Being that he was too little to climb the tree, he asked an officer who was passing by if he would climb up and get it for him. The officer graciously accepted and brought down a headset that had been flung from the airplane. Bernie brought that headset in that day and let me hold it in my hands. 24 hours after the crash, he mentioned that the tail section was still sitting in the field. He and his friends would play inside the tail after school. And after 2 days, the tail was finally cleaned up. But my tiny piece of glass, along with various other fragments, would be lodged in the mud until I came to pick it up 72 years later. Before leaving, James gave me a few more things to haul off. One was a copy of the actual briefing sheet that they had received that morning, complete with fuel loads, routes, radio call signs, and a formation map. He also gave me a picture of the wreckage, which I hold dear to my heart to this day. It is primarily a picture of the broken tail section along the hedge line directly under the live oak. I had been standing in the same exact spot. What is even more amazing is that David, the man that took my picture with his fancy Nikon, was standing in the same exact spot as the photographer on the day of the crash in 1945. It wasn't until I'd returned home that I had noticed how perfectly identical the photos were. On our way back to King's Cross, we stopped once again in Cambridge, this time with enough of a layover to grab some beers for the rails. We figured 12 minutes was plenty of time to get some toast-worthy beverages to salute the entire crew of the natural metal finish Men of Old Buck B-24J. Back over the pond we go to finally bring a part of Uncle Robby back to the States. To this day, the model of his exact B-24 hangs in my office. Directly below it hang the shadow boxes of all the aircraft parts found that day. I never was able to positively identify everyone in that crew photo, with the exception of my uncle. I have my theories, given the hats that the officers wore, but I couldn't know for sure. Several months later, my grandmother had decided to finally move away from her home in Virginia, out here to Texas with the rest of the family. My father flew to the East Coast to help her pack up all of her belongings. God bless my gran, she holds on to everything. Her motto surely is, you never know when you'll need it. During the shuffle of all her belongings, my father made sure to secure the letter that was written to her from my Uncle Robby just 12 days before he died. He also came across an old shoebox. It was one of those boxes that was practically 50 years old but in perfect mint condition. And at the bottom of that box lay a crew photo. All 10 crew members in the same exact pose, but this time with smiles on their faces. My grandma had completely forgotten about it. It was sent to her by Uncle Robby when he arrived overseas. My dad brought it by the house when he arrived home to show me. I thought to myself, that's too bad. We'll still never know who the rest of these men are. And then I turned over the photo. Uncle Robby had written everyone's name, rank, and position from left to right, almost as if he knew I'd be looking for it one day. But information will dry up soon enough. For another 2 years, research had stalled. I'll admit, I wasn't trying that hard anymore, because after all, what else could I possibly find? We found his burial plot, we have his story, and we have his airplane. But there's always something more to discover. A recent scroll of the 453rd Bomb Group Facebook page had me land on a random mission formation map out of Old Buckingham. It was dated September 8th, 1944. That was 3 months before he died. What are the odds? I wondered. I sifted through the formation map to find Alan Judd's name in the formation. The radio call sign that labels the airplane was different, though, from the one that had crashed. And just like that, I discovered another one of their missions and another airplane that they flew within their squadron. My present-day research has produced 5 different formation maps out of the 18 they had flown. Within those 5 maps, 4 different serial numbers were flown. Names of the airplanes include Silent Yoakum, Lover's Lane, Dumbo, and, of course, the airplane that was the victim of the crash on New Year's Day, which, according to records, did not have a name. I'm currently on a mission to find the remaining 13 maps. You must have been thinking, throughout this entire episode, just as I have over the past 3 years, what an amazing fluke. What a coincidence to have all of this unfold the way that it did. Well, I'll leave you with this. Kevin Malone from The Office said it best. A fluke is one of the most common fish in the sea. So, if you go fishing for a fluke, chances are you might just catch one. Hey everyone, I didn't want to interrupt your listening in the middle of the show, so I thought I'd put this at the end. I just wanted to take a brief moment and thank each and every one of you for listening to Warbirds. Now, as you already know, this show airs every 2 weeks. But if you want to narrow that down to once per week, there is a way. There's a members-only site of mine located on Patreon, and for $5 a month, you can gain access to 2 additional shows every month that regular Apple or Google subscribers won't have access to. I'll put a link in the show notes for you to make it easy to get there. Along with these members-only ad-free episodes, you'll gain early access to the regularly published bi-weekly episodes. In addition to that, you'll get a special sneak peek at upcoming episodes in the queue. I'll even be taking suggestions from members as to the topics that you want to hear. So if you're hungry for more stories, and 2 stories per month just won't tide you over, go ahead and download the Patreon app on your device. That's Patreon, or the link in the show notes, and sign up for a free account. Once you've signed up, search for Warbirds and you'll find the show pretty quickly. $5 a month will give you double the amount of shows and lots more. With your support, it'll give me a lot more time to focus on producing quality shows for you, and it'll keep me out of the air and at home more often. which I'm sure my wife would appreciate as well. So thanks so much again for supporting Warbirds, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.